Welcome to the channel. Today we are going to discuss building a MCP server with Java and Spring Boot. Before jumping into the code, let's have a quick recap of what we have discussed during the last session. So this is where the MCP stands in the whole ecosystem. So that's what we discussed last time. And then we discussed the local MCP server. Local MCP server is always started by a MCP host application as a sub process, and the communication channel between the MCP client and the server is standard IO. So then we discuss about the remote MCP server. Remote MCP server always runs somewhere on the internet, and the host application connects to the remote MCP server via HTTP. So that's what we discuss. Now let's jump into developing the MCP server with Java and Spring Boot. So in order to build the MCP server, we first need to scaffold Spring Boot application. So how do we usually do this? Via Spring Initializer. So we go to the Spring Initializer. So we select Gradle here. That's my preference. So if you want, you can select Maven, and then the Spring Boot version is this, and then I'll change the group to dev.tsg.demos, and I'll change my application to my MCP server. So that's just example. So then packaging jar and configuration I will use as YAML, and the Java version I will use as 2021. So then let's hit the so before hitting the generate, I need to add a dependency, because since we are building MCP server, we need to add a specific dependency. So if I click the dependencies and if I type MCP, you will see 3 items, but since we are building a MCP server, I will select this. So because we want to make this application a MCP server, so let's hit generate. So now it will generate the zip file. I'll select desktop as the location to save. Okay, now if I open my desktop, so you will see this. We will unzip it and we can see the unzip file, and then let's open a terminal and let's open the code using the VS Code. So I'll say code dot on this location. So then it will open my generated MCP server code on the VS Code editor. So let's give a couple of seconds for the VS Code editor to load my application. Okay, now the source code is ready on the VS Code. Let's now jump into the code and see what changes we need to make. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to look at it. I'm going to look at the build.gradle. So look at the dependencies. So when we look at the dependencies, you can see that the MCP server dependencies there is other thing standards dependencies coming to any other Spring Boot application. So this is the only thing we are going to focus. So now when you look at this dependency, this dependency will support only a locally running MCP server. So since I'm going to discuss both a local and a remote MCP server, I want to keep that option open, not just limiting to a locally running MCP server. So I'm going to switch this dependency to enable web support. So now I change that dependency to MCP server web MAC. Okay, so this dependency will support both a local MCP server and a remote MCP server. We will first look at building a local MCP server, and then we will see how we can switch the same MCP server to be a remote MCP server. So now the question is how we can configure our MCP server application to be a locally running or a remotely running MCP server. So the beauty of this Spring Boot framework is we can control all these behaviors via the application properties. So now let's see what application properties we need to introduce to support a locally running MCP server first. So then let's go to the source code. Okay, and let's go to main resources and the application YAML. So this one, since we selected YAML as the configuration, now you have application.yaml. But if you select the properties, you will have application.properties. But you understand the difference. So now let's see. Okay, what do we need to introduce to configure this MCP server to be a local MCP server? So now, based on our previous discussion, the most important thing of the locally running MCP server is the client and the server communicates via standard IO. So that means, so that's the first property we need to introduce. We need to tell the communication channel must be standard IO. So let's get the property here, which required AI MCP server, and then I'll say this should be standard IO, STD, yeah, standard IO should be true. So this is the first property we need to introduce. So the once you introduce this property, so that means we tell we are going to build a locally running MCP server which supports client server communication with standard IO. So that's the first property. Now, as I told you earlier, since we already gave the web support here, now we need to switch off the web support through the application properties because we are going to build a locally running MCP server. So let's see what property we need to introduce here to disable the web support. So the property we need to introduce is, so that is under here, main dot web application type. Yeah, so this should be equal to none. Yeah, so now that is the other property we need to introduce. Now once you introduce these these two properties, so we are ready with our MCP server. So now we should be able to build this MCP server, and we should be able to start a host application and ask the host application to start the MCP server and connect to it. Let's first build the MCP server now. We'll go to this and we'll open a terminal. So since I have saved everything, so since my build system is Gradle, I'll say Gradle w clean build. So let's see whether what happens with. Okay, so the build is successful. Now when the build is successful, you will see this build folder here, and inside the build folder you will see libs, and you will see these two jar files created. So the plain jar and the standard jar, and this is the one we are going to use to run this MCP server. Now what's the MCP host application we are going to use to test this MCP server? So we are going to use the MCP inspector. So now let's start MCP inspector instance. I'll say new terminal. Yeah, because I don't want to interrupt the other one. So so since the MCP inspector, once it is started, since the MCP inspector wanted to access these jar files, so let's change our directory to the location where we have these jars. So that way we don't need to specify the paths of the jar file. So let's go to cd build libs. So now here you will see the MCP server, two jar files, but we only need this one. So now let's start the MCP inspector. How do we start the MCP inspector? So we use the npx command at model context protocol slash inspector. That's the command we are going to use. So now once you click, so the MCP inspector UI should be started in your default browser. So let's see where it is started. So yeah, it started and it says opening the browser, and I will grab that browser instance here, right? So this is the interface. So let's minimize this for a bit so we can see what's going behind the scenes using the logs. So now you should be able to, now this is our host application. Now once you started the host application, so how we discussed in the previous session, so we need to tell the host application to start the local MCP server first. So what is our local MCP server? So the local MCP server is inside this jar file. It's a Java program. So usually how do we start a Java program? So we need to issue the command Java, and then since the Java program is inside the jar file, we need to provide the arguments as -jar and the location and the name of the jar file. So if you want me to show the command that we need to issue, Java minus jar, and location slash sorry, this should be location and the jar file name dot jar. Basically this is the command we want to issue to start this MCP server. So now let's go to the MCP inspector and let's configure this command so that the MCP inspector can start this MCP server, and then it can connect to the MCP server once it is started. Okay, so let's go back to our MCP inspector. So we discussed, so this is a local MCP server. We have to use standard IO, and then what's the command we need to use to run the MCP server? Java is the command, and then what are the arguments we need to provide? We need to provide -jar and the jar file name. So the important thing here to note is all the arguments we need to enclose within double quotes. So therefore every argument, so -jar must be within double quotes and separated by spaces as usual. So then the next one is the jar file name. So I'll copy the jar file name from here. So this is the jar file name, and let's go back to the inspector and we'll paste the jar file name here. You don't need to give the the path of the jar file here because we started the MCP inspector from the location where the jar file exists. But if you start the MCP server from a different folder, then definitely you need to specify the path of the jar file. Now let's give the jar file name. So now all good. So now we should be able to click the connect. So once you click the connect, so the MCP inspector should first start the local MCP server using this command and these arguments, and then if it is successfully started the MCP server, so then the MCP inspector should be able to create a client instance and connect to that MCP server successfully. Let's see whether this is working. Click connect. So something happening you can see behind the scene. So it actually connected. Yeah, so because we can see that the tools and prompts, all these exist. So if you list tools and see that there are no tools at the moment because we created an empty MCP server. But still you can see some errors behind the scene. Let's look at these errors. So if you look at these errors, so I think the most important error is this MCP server syntax error, unexpected non-space, non-white space characters. So this is okay. So what is this problem? So this problem is, now you know that when we start any Spring Boot application, so always when you start a Spring Boot application, it logs the Spring banner into the standard output, as well as it logs so many other information to the standard output. So the problem is that all these Spring banners and other information logs are just text. They are not JSON RPC2 messages. So when you build a MCP server, a locally running MCP server, you should never put any non-JSON RPC messages into the standard output, because it can confuse the whole communication between the MCP client and the server, because local MCP servers are always communicating with the clients using the standard output, standard IO. So that's the most important thing we need to keep remember. We should never put anything into standard output. Basically, that means we should never put system.out.println statements in our during the building of our CP server, even for troubleshooting purpose, because those system.out means it is logging into the standard output, which confuse the whole communication messaging system. So now how do we control, or how do we stop Spring spitting out all these banners and other information to standard output? So again, as I told you earlier, all these we can control via the application properties. Okay, so let's see what application properties we need to introduce here. So before that, so let's stop the MCP server first. So let's stop this. I'll kill this, and then I'll close this also, because I will rebuild and I will start a new instance, brand new instance. So let's close this. Okay, now let's go and let's see what we need to introduce here. So the first thing is, so under this, so I told you two things. The Spring banner we need to switch off. So that means banner mode off. So when you introduce this banner mode off, the Spring won't spit out any banners, so which will confuse our communication systems in the MCP client and the server. So the other one we need to do is, we need to make sure we put the logging off. So that is logging, and the logging pattern console empty. So we need to keep this logging pattern console empty. So when you put the logging pattern console empty, so then the Spring will won't log anything to the standard output. So once we introduce these two, so we save this and we need to rebuild. So once we rebuild, and when we go to the inspector again, so you should not, or you will not see any of these errors. Let's try it. So let's first build the application, the jar, do another clean build, and close this. So let's give a couple of seconds until it builds the new jar. Okay, so the jar, that is successful. Let's go to the other terminal. So let's clear this. I'll refresh this again. Okay, let's see. Okay, the two jars exist. Now we start the MCP inspector again, and we'll try the same thing as earlier. So let's give a couple of seconds until the MCP inspector starts. Okay, it says open in the browser, and let's open the browser. Yeah, so all good. Now it started, and standard IO Java same as earlier, and let's click connect. So ideally it should connect, and you should not see any errors in the logs. Okay, so looks like now it's all good. So connected, and there are no errors here. So you will see that, right? So, and for example, if you go to tools and if you say list tools, so see there are still no messages, no errors in the logs, and the tools response is empty because we built a empty MCP server. So that's how we build a locally running empty MCP server. So now let's disconnect this, and let's close this, and let's see how we can switch this server to be a remotely running MCP server. So let's close this again, and let's kill this terminal. Okay, so now as I told you again, so all these switching between local and remote and everything, so we have to do through application properties. So let's see what application properties we need to change or introduce to make this MCP server to be a remotely running MCP server. So let's see. Okay, so the first thing, so this is not when we look back to our previous session, so we know that remote MCP servers are not running through standard IO. So that means we need to definitely change it. So so the first property we need to introduce is server. So this need to be changed now. So that should be protocol, and that protocol should be streamable. So that's what we discussed in the last session, right? And then we don't need to have any of these properties. Only this property is enough. So let's make these properties commented out. So, and now let's save this, save all. And now what we need to do is we need to rebuild this. So let's open the terminal, and we go to our build terminal, and we'll clear this, and we'll do this again. So we'll rebuild it, and we'll see whether it is successful. Give it a couple of seconds until it is done. Okay, build is successful. Now, since this is remotely running MCP server, we know that the host application is not going to start the server. We need to first start the server. So how can we start this server? So it's easy, right? So it's a standard Spring Boot application. So what we need to do is we need to go to the main application class, and we need to just start this main application class. And so let's see, let's run this, and let's see what's happening. So it should ideally, once this is, if this is successfully started, it should ideally start a HTTP server uh, running on port 8080. So let's see what's happening. Okay, so now looks like it started successfully. So it says process running. So now what we need to do is we need to start the MCP inspector again, and we need to try and connect to this. So we don't need to give any commands to start. We just need to try and try to connect to it through the MCP inspector. Let's start the MCP inspector again. So I'll clear this, and let's start the MCP inspector. So that's all good. What does it say? No such file, sorry. Yep, so this is because this lib folder is refreshed. Double slash libs, we don't need to be in libs folder anyway now, right? Because we are not going to access any of those jar files. So let's go to a different folder just to try it out, right? So now I am in this particular location. So let's start the MCP server. Sorry, let's start the MCP inspector. So give couple of seconds until it started, right? Open in the browser. So yep. So the that is started. Now since our MCP server is already running, right? So let's go to that logs here. So and since it is already running, so we can't use standard IO. We have to use streamable HTTP. Since this is now a remote one, which is I told you that it's a Spring application, web application running on port 8080. So HTTP localhost. So so this should be 8080. And since we haven't configured any special endpoints to access the MCP server, the default one will be always /MCP. So this is how we can access our locally running MCP server. So now we selected streamable and we selected the URL of our locally running MCP server, and then let's say we connect to it. So let's see whether it is successfully connecting. Yeah, so it's successfully connected. You can see there are no errors in our MCP application, or there are no errors in our MCP inspector logs as well. So now if we go here and if we click as usual list tools, and it's a list tools, and it's returning an empty response because our MCP server is an empty one, right? So now okay, so this is how we switch from the local to a remote MCP server. So before finishing this session, so I will quickly show you how to configure a couple of properties on the MCP server application so that you can control some of these items in this URL. So let's again close this, and let's kill this one, and let's stop our application as well. So what I'm going to now explain you through the application properties, how we can change the endpoint of the MCP server, as well as how we can change the running port of the MCP server. So the first thing we are going to do is we are going to change the running port of the MCP server. So that is, there's not in this property, there's nothing difference, nothing special, or it's not anything related to MCP. It's a standard Spring Boot application configuration. So let's say I want to run on this port 9999. So that is, then you need to introduce server.port. So that is introduced, and then the other thing we need to configure is the MCP endpoint. So how we can configure the MCP endpoint under this server here. At this level, we need to say, okay, I'm sorry, control is streamable MCP endpoint. So this is the one we need to change. So this is the default one. So let's say we want to change it to something like this, API MCP. So we just change it like this. So we introduce streamable HTTP MCP endpoint. So now let's save this, save all, and let's open the terminal, and let's rebuild, clean build. Give it a couple of seconds until it's built. And then let's go and start the application once the build is successful. So, and once the application started, we can try connecting through the MCP inspector by using the new port and the new endpoint. So that's built. So let's start this. Start. So let's give a couple of seconds until it started. Let's wait. Yeah, so it started, and let's go to our other terminal. So clear, and we are going to start the MCP inspector. So let's wait until it is started. And earlier we will try connecting it. So open in the browser. So now let me open. Yeah, so this is started, and now you should not be able to connect through this URL because we changed the port and the endpoint. So let's try connecting, and let's see what's going to happen. So here, so connect. So see that it says it cannot connect because failed to connect. Because it's not running on port 88. So which port it is running? One. So we gave this port number, and we changed the endpoint also to be API MCP. So this one. So now let's try connect. Yeah, it's successfully connected now, right? So let's close the developer window, and let's go to the tools again, list tools. And if we click the list tools, it's an empty response. So that means our empty MCP server is running successfully. So that's how you can customize some of these properties here. So that's the end of this session. So now you have the full understanding of how we can scaffold MCP server to be a locally running MCP server or a MCP server using Java and Spring Boot. In the next video, we are going to discuss how to implement the primitives, the tools, resources, and prompts. See you in the next video.